Hello and welcome. My name is Craig Guyman, and I'm going over the Binalize AIR platform today. AIR is an automated incident response platform that provides the most complete feature set for the following digital forensics and incident response use cases. It allows, number one, quick remote collection of almost 300 forensic artifacts and evidence items in minutes from Windows, Linux, and Mac OS systems. Secondly, it allows you to collect the forensic state of endpoints in a well-organized set of HTML reports that allow SOC and DFIR practitioners to quickly determine whether there are relevant threats that require action, or identifying and closing out false positive scenarios without the need for escalation using AIR's DFIR post-processing analyzers called Drone. Number three, performing triage, scanning on thousands of endpoints using Yara, Sigma, and OS query rules to determine if cyber threats exist. Number four, the ability to quickly create endpoint timelines using our one-click timeline capability. This ability allows you to enrich these timelines with information from firewall, SIM, EDR, and other CSV-based logs for comprehensive and collaborative incident response. Number five, investigating alerts generated by other products by integrating AIR with SIM, SOAR, and EDR tools such as QRadar, Splunk, CrowdStrike, Carbon Black, and many others. Number six is the ability to remediate cases very quickly. This is done using the interact capability of Binalize AIR. And what this does is allows you to identify selected threats and remediate them using our DFIR-focused cross-platform remote shell here in the interface. The last capability that I'll go over is the baseline analysis capability using Compare. Compare is a patent-pending comparison capability to quickly identify unusual activity based on previously collected acquisitions and allowing you to compare them to subsequent collections. In the next several minutes, I'll be going over all of these functionalities with you, showing you every capability within the Binalize AIR platform. In this section of the video for Binalize AIR, I'd like to quickly go over the setup, hardware requirements, pre-installation steps, and installation, and even the upgrade steps to set up Binalize AIR. It's very easy to get this going. And you start by going to this knowledge base article for kb.binalize.com/air/setup. In this knowledge base article, we outline the hardware requirements necessary to set up Binalize AIR in your cloud tenant or on a server in your data center. We offer two deployment methods. The first is a single tier deployment, and the second is a two-tier deployment, allowing you to separate the console and the database servers. You can see here all of the required minimum and suggested specs for RAM, CPU, and disk. We also provide the same information for single tier and two-tier deployments in Azure, AWS, and GCP. In addition to the hardware requirements, we provide you with pre-installation steps necessary to assign to your system or systems before you begin the installation. You will need to assign a static IP address or an elastic IP address if working with an AWS public-facing system, and allow certain ports both inbound and outbound to allow users to collect endpoint data and use the console. Lastly is the installation step. The installation boils down to this: installing on a Ubuntu 20.04 or 22.04 system, then after getting that up and running an apt-get update, and running the following script. This will install all of the necessary Docker containers to allow the Binalize AIR platform to be available to you for you to set up all of your endpoints and start using and getting the benefits from Binalize AIR. I'm now going to go over how to update the Binalize AIR platform. This can be done very easily by going to the knowledge base article kb.binalize.com/air/update. We outline both single-tier updates and two-tier updates. As with all updates, it's commonplace to go ahead and back up your database before beginning. After you have completed the backup, you can then change directories to the OPT Binalize AIR directory, and after you have performed that step, you can run the following command, which is outlined in the upgrade steps. This will stop all of the individual Docker containers for Binalize Air. After this is done, we will perform a Docker Compose pull. This will allow us to pull the latest versions of the software. We'll now run that command. That will then pull those Docker containers. Once that's done, you'll now be able to pull the Binalize Air platform back up again using the following command. And I'll use the Docker sudo command here. That will pull the system back up, and in just a few seconds, your console will be ready to go again. I can now see that all of my systems are running properly on that system using my SSH connection to that remote system, and we're done with the upgrade. In this section of the video, I'd like to explain how to deploy agents to traditional endpoints such as Linux, Windows, and Mac. In particular, we're going to focus on how to deploy an agent to a Mac OS endpoint. That endpoint is another system within my lab, and I'll show you how to do that. After clicking on the endpoints section of the Air console, you'll click the drop down for Add New, and because we're going to focus on traditional endpoints, we're going to focus on Deploy New. You'll select your organization, which in this case is Blue Ridge Cyber. Click Next Step. And because I'm already on the macOS package, I can go ahead and just copy my curl command. The same thing would be true for Linux, Debian, and RPM packages. These two also use curl and wget commands, which we'll be using for macOS today. Windows uses PowerShell command or PowerShell script, as well as the ability to download the MSI and directly install it, or use the shareable deployment link, which is a very common methodology for our MSSP customers. I'll focus on how to deploy using the curl command. I'll copy that command, open up my terminal session, and in my terminal session, I've already typed it in. I'll go ahead and hit enter, and then this will go ahead and install the agent on that endpoint. Once that's done, that will show up in my endpoint console page as soon as the installation is completed, which you'll see happening on the screen in just a moment. It's now installing it. It's installed successfully. I'll go back to my page here, and you'll see that if I refresh this, I'll now see Mac Mini, which was just recently added a few seconds ago. At this stage, I'll be able to perform all of the abilities of the Binalize Air platform, including acquisition, triage, interact for remediation, building of timelines, and the comparison, which we'll cover in the next sections. Now that we've deployed an agent to a Mac system, let's go ahead and try collecting data from an endpoint, in this case a Windows system. From our organizations list, we have the ability to select bulk endpoints, or we have the ability to filter for multiple endpoints using the center area of the endpoints page within the Binalize Air platform. I'm going to go ahead and focus specifically on one particular endpoint and show how to collect information and data and evidence from this endpoint, as well as explain the different evidence and artifacts that can be collected using Binalize Air. When selecting the option to acquire evidence, I want to point out that you have the ability to both acquire evidence or full disk acquisitions from endpoints. We'll be focusing primarily on acquiring evidence. This can be done by first selecting a case to associate this with. Once you have selected the case, you then have the ability to choose your acquisition profile. I'll be pre-selecting an acquisition profile that comes with Binalize Air called the Compromise Assessment Collection. However, you have the ability to also create your own. We'll be showing this in just a few seconds after I've kicked off this collection. I'll choose Compromise Assessment, and I'll go ahead and click on Start, at which point we'll go ahead and describe some of the other artifacts allowed to be collected with the Binalize Air platform, as well as the drone capability. So while pressing Start, and while that runs in the background, I'll go through the creation of an acquisition profile so that I can explain the different types of artifacts that can be collected with Binalize Air. I'm not going to actually create an acquisition profile, but instead go ahead and just go over the different types of evidence that can be collected. This includes all of the major system information that can be retrieved from a Windows system, including things like the clipboard, the driver list, the recycle bin, the crash dump log, as well as a shadow copy as a CSV, and things like downloaded files information or USB storage history information. Additionally, you can collect the master boot record or the volume information from a system, or you can get a RAM capture from an endpoint as well as the Hyperfill. All of the major browsers can be collected. Master file table from an NTFS volume information. You can collect the MFT as a CSV or as the mirror, the $log file, and the USN journal information can be collected. All of the major registry hives can also be collected, allowing you to get insights into how the system is being used. For example, being able to identify the Internet Explorer typed paths or the first folders or recent docs. Additionally, you have the ability to also collect information from network data, including the DNS cache, UDP table, TCP table, and the IPv routes table, as well as the host information. Event logs being a key part of incident response cases, you are able to collect EVT and EVTX files and parse them out as records. The Windows Management Instrumentation information is also able to be collected, along with process execution elements such as your prefetch files, the SRUM or System Resource Usage Monitor, and the AMCache data. The Other Evidences category also allows you to collect jump lists, link files, superfetch, PowerShell logs, as well as your thumb cache and your RDP cache files. This is just the beginning of the types of evidence that can be collected, and it's expanded upon in the artifact list, which is more server or application specific. This allows you to get things like your Apache logs, your IIS logs, or other server-specific logs that are important for SOC analysts to be able to retrieve quickly. You also have specific Microsoft application logs that can also be collected, as well as communication data from tools like AnyDesk, LogMeIn, Microsoft Mail, and Skype. Beyond this, you have the ability to collect social artifacts from things like Facebook databases, Twitter cache and Twitter databases, as well as productivity artifacts from Notepad++, Sublime, Evernote, utility artifacts like VMware config and backups from iTunes, as well as developer tools and cloud artifacts. And maybe most importantly in this list is the ability to collect things like antivirus logs to complete your investigation. In order to have the clearest possible view of what's going on in a system, having insight into what's going on in the antivirus logs could be very, very useful. In addition to that, things like your Carbon Black logs, or even your F-Secure and McAfee and Malwarebytes logs, as well as Sentinel-1 log if necessary. This is a list that we add to quite regularly, so if there's something that you would like us to add, by all means let us know and we're happy to look into it. I also want to point out that if it's not in that list today, you also have the ability to use something called custom content profiles, which allows you to add a variety of different paths or file types that you want to collect from an endpoint system or a series of endpoint systems. So in this example, we're using all users' documents, but I could come in and I could edit this and I could say I wanted to get all Excel spreadsheets, or I could get all macro enabled spreadsheets, and I could just continue adding different file paths using wildcards and pathing for the specific operating system that I am targeting. So in this case, I'm using backslashes instead of forward slashes because this is a Windows collection. Had I been collecting from a Mac or a Linux system, I would be using the forward slash. This is quite a flexible capability. And then the collection capabilities are rounded out by the ability to collect network information such as NetFlow data, TCP and UDP connection information to CSV files, or full payload PCAP files that can also be collected up to a period of 60 minutes. Now let's go back to our collection and let's see exactly what's happening in the task list. And you can see that it's now processed all the information from that compromise assessment collection, and it's now analyzing it using Drone. Let's talk just a few minutes about Drone before concluding this section of the video. When collecting information, in addition to selecting the case, the acquisition profile, and your options, you also have the ability to use Drone keywords, which will apply to your search and apply to the report later on. So if I want to look for terms like Neil Stevenson or 49ers or Thor or any number of different keywords, I can put those in here. I can also use wildcards and regular expressions as well. These keywords will then be part of my report later on, allowing me to focus in on the specific areas where these keywords are hit. More importantly, the drone capability within Binalyze Air is a decision support system for analysts and SOC practitioners, allowing them to identify anomalous behavior within the corpus of the data that's being collected from the endpoint. So if you're looking for areas that come from the MITRE ATT&CK framework, we'll be identifying that stuff specifically for those practitioners, as well as anomalous activity that happens within the DNS cache, the host file, vulnerabilities that potentially are lurking about on those systems, as well as potential ransomware identifiers, and various other scanners and analyzers allowing practitioners to be able to identify very quickly the types of activity that they should be looking for right out of the gate. Now that the completion of this compromise assessment collection is just about done, you'll notice that we have the ability to look at the report. Well, the report is the next section that we'll be talking about. To this point, we've talked about how to acquire data from an endpoint in a manual fashion, using the acquisition drop-down menu within the Binalyze Air console to kick off a manual collection. I'd also like to point out that there are a couple other ways to collect data from an endpoint on a proactive level. The first of those two mechanisms is to be able to schedule tasks. You can create new tasks to be able to collect information on a daily, weekly, or monthly basis, employing the same exact principles I shared with you earlier by selecting an acquisition profile to collect, or being able to apply the drone keywords and different analyzers and scanners that can be employed for post-processing analysis. After creating a scheduled acquisition, it will be added as a scheduled task and will kick off exactly at the time that the scheduled task is set to perform. Another methodology that can be used to create acquisitions, automated acquisitions from systems, is using webhooks. Webhooks is a good way to be able to leverage the systems or platforms you have for DFIR purposes such as SIM, SOAR, and EDR tools. Binalyze Air allows you to select a predefined list of different parsers from EDR, SIM, and SOAR vendors that you might already have in place. Things like Cortex XSOAR or Carbon Black or CrowdStrike. We add to this list regularly, and so if you have something in mind that you'd like to add, let us know, and we can probably add it for you very quickly. In this case, I'll use Slack or Splunk. In fact, in this example, I'll use Splunk Phantom. The same principles that I used earlier to perform a manual collection or a scheduled task apply here. When the trigger from Splunk or CrowdStrike or Carbon Black is tripped, that can then tell Binalyze Air to go ahead and do an automated collection of an acquisition profile from that endpoint that triggered that alert. In this case, if we select down through this list, you have the ability to choose all of the same acquisition profiles that were shown before. Again, I'll choose compromise assessment. In addition to being able to choose the exact data to collect from that endpoint, you have the ability to set some ignores, meaning do not execute this collection again within this amount of time so as to not be inundated with multiple collections when not necessary. So if after 4 hours or 8 hours you want that alert to also kick off another collection, it will then do so. Again, the drone keywords and drone scanners and analyzers apply to a collection done using the automated webhook capability. Now that we've talked about how to deploy agents and how to acquire data and evidence from endpoints, let's talk about some of the reports that are available and some other types of ways to look at data within the Binalyze Air platform. While I'm in this endpoint details for Craig's computer, you can see that we've already gone over the acquisition of data and how to do scheduled tasks as well as the webhooks. In addition to this, you have the ability to perform timelines. This is yet another report that's available within the Binalyze Air platform. Before I go into the timeline, let me just quickly show you how to get to the report once a task has been completed. Once a task has been completed from the tasks list, you can simply go to the task in question and you can see details around it. I'm going to go back to some of my earlier collections on page 7 of this history, and I'm going to look for a full acquisition, which in this case is right here. I can click on the view report icon. That will then bring up the report for me to then view live at that particular point in time. I then have the ability to start looking at the drone findings and dig into each individual artifact to identify exactly why drone identified these items as suspicious, relevant, high, rare, or other finding categories. If I hover over suspicious in this case, you can see that SVC host is too small and it has suspicious process with unexpected properties. In addition to being able to see that, I can bookmark this item so as to be able to send it off an HTML report or send it off in a PDF or have others collaborate with me inside the web UI for the Binalize Air console. I'm also able to see all of the parsed out information for this particular artifact and various others, including things like the command line arguments, the process path, whether it has a digital signature, who it's published by, and all of the appropriate times that are parsed from that artifact, as well as a hash that allows me to cross-reference that information across VirusTotal. Doing this gives me additional insight into the behavior, relations, and details of a particular artifact that might help me with my investigation. If I close this out, you'll notice that I then have the ability to perform other types of reports, including a timeline. The timeline can be created by simply clicking on the drop-down and choosing Create Timeline, or I can do this on the left side of the window by going to my timeline and opening up an existing timeline and adding other additional endpoints to it. In this case, if I go down to Liam's desktop endpoint, you'll see that the timeline details report will come up for this machine, including one other machine, in this case, Craig's desktop. The timeline allows me to filter out unnecessary or unwanted dates and times from this report so as to narrow down the scope of what's being seen. So if, for example, all I wanted to see was file accessed, file created, and file downloaded, I could deselect all the other items in this list and then simply say apply. And when I do that, it will then reduce down the timeline to show me only line items that include file accessed, file created, file downloaded, and file executed. Furthermore, I have the ability to search this to look for specific types of activity. Since this system doesn't have any malware on it, I'll look for the word StarCraft, which in this case happens to be a video game. When I type that in, it will then look across both Craig's desktop and Liam's desktop for any references to the word StarCraft, which will indicate that the execution and the prefetch files associated with the program StarCraft have been run in this case. I can select any line item and I can then look at the event details by clicking on the up arrow in the event details section of the window. This allows me to see pertinent information about whether the file exists, what the hash is, what the publisher of that particular file is, and the entropy level that might be useful to my investigation. Additionally, I have the ability to export this out, go to a specific date, or enrich this timeline with additional information including additional endpoints, off-network systems, CSV data from various sources such as firewall logs, SIM logs, SOAR logs, or EDR logs, as well as bringing in milestone data such as the time and date a specific activity took place that is worth noting. So for example, perhaps there was somebody within the organization that was recently terminated or recently hired, and you want to look around that date and time to see if any other activity took place. You can add that as a milestone, which will add a flag to the report, allowing you to then focus on all the other activity around that date and time. Of course, being able to use that in conjunction with my keyword and my filter allows me to narrow the scope even further. So if I wanted to look for activity across multiple machines using the word StarCraft that involve Craig G, I could do that by applying that filter, and now the end results will be much more narrow, allowing me to see only activity that involves Craig G, StarCraft at that particular date and time. In this next section of the Binalize Air platform video, I'd like to explain how to take your investigation to the next level. Now that we've deployed agents, acquired evidence, and created acquisition profiles to target the artifacts you're interested in, and you've looked at the reports and created timelines, you can use the information gathered in the acquisition and your reports to build triage scans to run across the rest of the organization. This can be done in Binalize Air by going to the endpoint, going to the ellipsis for a specific batch of systems, such as all computers under the Blue Ridge Cyber organization and choosing triage, and then selecting the triage rules you want to apply across that section of your organization. You associate this with a case and select your different triage rules. Before we select the triage rules, let's go ahead and import a new Yara rule, which is the same steps you'll take for both Sigma and OS Query as well. Yara allows you to create your own rules using the editor and the validator that's here, or I can upload a rule. And uploading a rule is very easy. You just select your folder that you want to pull this from. I'll choose my malicious PDF Yara rule and say open. And that then adds this to my editor, at which point if I want to edit this, I can certainly do so. If I want to validate it, I simply validate it. It's been validated successfully. And if I wanted to add additional conditions to this, I could do that as well, such as adding a file access time to this particular rule if I wanted to. I'll cancel that because I don't want to do that. So I'll just take that out of there. And I'll save that rule. And now it's available for me after I've added this as a rule with a name. I'll go ahead and call this malicious PDF rule. And I'll hit save here. Now that that's been added, I can select all the rules or a combination of any of those rules and say start. And when I do that, it will then run across all of the systems within the bank of systems that I selected to run against. Once that's done, a report will then be generated to show you any matches to those rules that were run. So if I go to my tasks list, I'll be able to see a previous triage that was run on Craig's computer, at which point I'll be given another report that allows me to see the different matches. In this case, I ran searches specifically for some simple JPEGs and looking for matches of hashes. If I come in here, I can see the find by hash rule was a match to this particular file, and this is the hash value. There was no digital signature found. Here's all the rest of the metadata around that particular match. All of my drone findings can also be identified here as well. So if there's any drone findings along with my YAR rule scan, it will also include that information, as well as the case information and the system information from the endpoints that have been collected. You also have the ability to look at this from the case menu. Looking at this from the case menu can be done by looking at the cases on the left, choosing the appropriate case, selecting it, and then allowing you to see all the triages that were run across that particular set of systems. If I click on the triage button, you'll see all the triages I've run in the BRC002 case. This is also a good point to point out that in addition to being able to see match counts and any actions you want to perform on these individual triages, we also now offer a consolidated executive report that shows all of the results of all of your findings across multiple systems consolidated into one finding report. So in this case, I've done 52 acquisitions across these various systems, 2 Windows, Craig and Liam's desktops, these 2 Linux systems, Rocky and Craig Inspiron, as well as these 2 Macs, this iMac and Test iMac systems. At this point, I have the ability to see all of my drone findings across all of those systems, as well as filter for specific findings from different platforms, as well as seeing all of my Yara, Sigma, or OS Query findings. So if I had any matches to triages on multiple systems, this would be a great place to look at those, and I could see that across both Craig's system and Liam's system, this JPEG was a find by hash match, and it shows the hash exactly as it was in my previous report, giving me further visibility across multiple systems, allowing me as an examiner or analyst to perform my job much more quickly. Now that we've acquired data and triaged that data, we're in a position to be able to remediate from the endpoints using some of the matched triage rules and the acquired data that we've accessed and looked at the reports from earlier. To do this in Binalize Air, you have the ability to remediate using Interact, which is our cross-platform remote shell capability, allowing you to have a DFIR-focused session, remote shell session with this endpoint to perform DFIR functions. Now, before I go into this capability, I want to expound upon some of the options that are available to you, which are also available in all of the other tasks that can be performed on an endpoint in Binalize Air. This includes being able to save data to an evidence repository, set CPU limits, which can be very useful during specific activities such as performing triages or acquisitions. I can set this CPU limit to, in this case, let's say 70%. And of course, I can encrypt and compress the data. I'll choose to compress this data, and I'll say start, which will then begin establishing a connection with Craig's desktop, allowing me to then list all the DFIR focused commands that I can run on this system. If I run an ls, you now see that I have the ability to see the directory that I'm currently in at this moment. If I want to then run a get on, say for example, the desktop.ini file, I can do that. Or I can go back and change directories into the Craig directory if I want to. and I will say clear and ls. And now I can see all of the files within that directory. If one of these files was a file that was causing problems on this system, I could in fact kill that system, kill that process or file using the kill command. If I type in help again, you'll see a list of all the different commands that I have available to me. I won't go through these all, but I will show you just a couple that are very useful. The ability to cat out the contents of a file, changing directories, running an HTTPS request using curl, deleting a file using various formats of the delete command to delete a file or directory, list out the directory using ls or dir, perform a find. I've already showed you how to perform a get. I can run help on any of the options I have here. So if I want to run OS query, for example, and run help, that will tell me exactly how to use the OS query command within the Binalize Air DFIR shell interact. I can also image, although this is no longer necessary given the fact that you have the ability to do this from the console without having to have a shell session created. I can kill processes, make directories, or even put files on the endpoint in question. I also have at my disposal access to a library that I can upload scripts and tools to, allowing me to run from the command line remediation scripts that you might already have in place to do your jobs more effectively. If this is the case, you can simply upload those tools and scripts into this library, allowing you to then execute them from the DFIR shell interact. Once I close this session, a full audit trail of commands will be given to me. If I go to the tasks list, you'll see that this is processing what I've done, and I can immediately look at the report, which will show me all of the different commands that I ran, and I can expound on those, see exactly how long it took to run each of those commands, the dates and times, the response, the directory I was in, as well as all the individual detail. So in this case, a listing of everything that's in that particular directory and any transferred files that I transferred from the endpoint to my system. In this section of the video, I'd like to expound upon how to use Binalize Air to save data to evidence repositories and incorporate cloud platforms. While in any area of the Binalize Air platform, you have the ability to go to settings, whether from endpoints, cases, or dashboard. Under settings, I have the ability to come in and choose cloud platforms as well as evidence repositories. You can see I've got 4 different SMB shares set up here as evidence repositories. You can also set up additional ones using SFTP, FTPS, and Amazon S3, as well as Azure Blobs. It's very easy. You'll simply give it a name. Once you've given it a name, you'll put in the SaaS URL or the corresponding credentials necessary to authenticate to that source, and you'll save. Once that's been saved, it'll be listed in your evidence repositories where you'll have the ability to select it when performing acquisitions or performing interact sessions. You can employ this by going to the options, and underneath the options, you have the ability to leverage your evidence repositories. I can then select from my drop-down menu. In addition to the evidence repositories is the cloud evidence systems that you might want to collect from. My example below already has an Amazon Web Services example where I've authenticated using my AWS account information. I can add another account by simply following the steps that are outlined within this particular section. I'll need to apply a set of permissions to my user account, which can then be copied from here and imported into your user account under the security and settings of your account in AWS. Or I can use this CloudFormations link, which will allow me to then follow the steps necessary to ultimately apply the proper settings to my account. Once I've got the account name, account key ID, and the secret key access, I can associate that with a particular organization and save that, at which point I'll then have it available to me inside of my cloud platforms list, allowing me to then enumerate out systems that come from that particular cloud platform. In the example I'm showing you now, under Blue Ridge Cyber, I've already enumerated out some systems from AWS that my account, Craig.Guyman, has access to. I have access to these 4 systems, allowing me to then deploy agents to those systems and subsequently collect information just like I would from a regular computer, just like I've been showing you in previous sections of this video. So the operations would be exactly the same from that point on. In this section of the video, I'd like to cover the compare capability within Binalize Air. The compare capability allows 2 different collections or acquisitions from a system to be compared to one another. This starts with having a baseline acquisition from a system. This can be done in 2 ways. either from the organizational grouping called tags within your Binalyze Air platform. In this example, I'll use my Apache servers example, but this could be any group: IAS servers, accounting, finance, HR, C-level, any number of different logical groupings. And I can create a baseline of all those systems, or I can drill directly into an endpoint, and from there, click on the compare capability, and then click on the acquire baseline. I've already done that, and you can see that in this particular case, it only takes a few seconds to do that. So I'll go ahead and click on that now, just so you can see how that's done. This will create a task within the Binalyze Air platform, and about 30 seconds later, that baseline acquisition will be ready to use for comparison purposes. As that's currently assigning that to this endpoint right now, let's go ahead and take a previously acquired acquisition and compare it and show you how to use that capability. If I go back a few months and I choose, for example, an acquisition of full acquisition, I can select it, and I can select a baseline acquisition that I did 15 minutes ago that took 30 seconds, and I can say select and perform the compare capability. This creates yet another task. This task then shows up in my task list and allows me to then look at the results of that in just a few seconds. You can see that that's now completed. Once that's completed, I can click on the View Report option, and this will allow me to see a very, very specific set of additions, changes, and deletions from this system from key areas of that particular endpoint, including everything from the system level, such as DNS changes, network adapters, any changes within the installed applications, firewall rules, drivers, service autoruns, scheduled task autoruns, and registry autoruns. By way of example, I can click on Added, and I can add firewall rules. And I can see any added firewall rules that were added to this system between the time that this was originally compared, which is 4 months ago, and the acquisition that I performed just a few hours ago. I can drill down into each of those, and of course there's no starting point because these were additions. So I can now see the create dates, the create times, and all the details associated with those firewall rule changes. The same thing is true of changes, where a firewall rule already existed, and I have the ability to scroll down through this list, and for example, I can look at the Armory socket server and see exactly when it was modified the firewall rule or added the firewall rule for an allow, and it changed the firewall rule a little bit later. Anything within this list can be expanded, and you can look at all the individual details. This is also true of deletions. So if, for example, an application was added or deleted, I can go down into the applications and I can see these applications were deleted. These applications were changed in some way or another, probably upgraded in many cases, or these applications were added. I can also add additional filters in this list, and I can look at both installed applications and firewall rules, and I can see them both together in the changed or deleted list together if I would like. This concludes this section of the video. I've now covered all major areas of the Binalyze Air platform. There are, of course, other areas that could be explored, but to conclude our video today, I'd like to just quickly share with you that there are a number of settings under the gear option in the top right-hand corner of the console. Among these options is the ability to set up two-factor authentication or single sign-on authentication using Azure AD. In addition to that, there is documentation that you can click on here that allows you to look at the individual steps required to set up this integration, as well as the ability to secure your console using port 8443 or restrict it to specific IP addresses around the world. You can also set up an SMTP server for email-based user password resets, as well as sending the information from the audit logs inside of Binalyze Air to a syslog, as well as set up RFC 3161 timestamping, which is enabled by default, or to set up your backup schedule or location. If you'd like to schedule your Mongo backups, you can do so using this interface by enabling it and choosing how many backups you'd like to keep. Lastly, there are the API tokens, which allow you to interact and automate the capabilities within Binalyze Air with other platforms. The documentation for the API can be found in kb.binalyze.com. That is a very good resource if you are interested in automating the capabilities outside of the webhooks that we've covered in the previous sections of this video. If you have any other questions outside of what we've covered in this series, then let us know and we'd be happy to go over them with you individually. That concludes our session. Thank you, and I hope you have a great day.